The Revelation iteration of Orochi is perhaps most famous for dying as a green unit on turn 2 if you don't recruit her ASAP. And this is likely most people's only experience with Orochi, because she's not a particularly standout unit. She's your second diviner, but she joins a chapter after Hayato with mostly worse stats than him, only standing out with slightly more magic, and alongside several other strong units, with Reina, Saizo, and Kagero all joining on the same map as her, and Camilla, Selena, and Baruka joined shortly afterwards. This is a better position than units like Odin and Nyx are in, but not by much. And Orochi struggles to justify her presence on basically any team. But she does have a few things going for her, namely her sky-high magic growth and her unique personal skill, Capture, which allows you to imprison and recruit enemy soldiers into your army. Many people say that Capture is at its weakest in Rev, since you're unable to recruit Valite soldiers, and therefore the second half of the campaign has no use case for it. But I would argue, despite this, the capture mechanic is probably at its strongest in the Revelation route. And because of Niles' join time, realistically if you want to use captures, you have to put Orochi on your team. So while a portion of this video will be devoted to Makoto's retainer, the back half will be taking a look at the capturable generics and how they can potentially bolster your forces as well. This video is part of an ongoing series with the goal to do a deep dive into every single playable unit in Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. Yes, even that one. Despite the fact that the game has a reputation for being terribly unbalanced, I truly believe that every member of the cast can contribute to your team. But units in Fates are highly customizable, and this goes doubly so for Revelation, where each cast member has new options that are not available on their native routes. And so my goal is to go over the multiple potential builds that every member of the roster has. That way, if you want to play through Rev on its highest difficulty, you can utilize whoever your favorite characters are. I'm not going to pretend that all of these units are equally viable. In fact, a secondary goal of the series is to come up with a Revelation tier list, but I really do believe that everyone is at least salvageable and can offer you something unique. While this series is going to be focused around the Lunatic difficulty, much of what I say can also apply to the lower difficulties of Hard and Normal. Those difficulties have lower numbers for the enemies, so it's easier to reach stat thresholds, but things like various reclasses, available friendships, and specific builds that you can go into stay universal despite what difficulty you intend to play on. With all that out of the way, let's dive into our unit review. God, that's either the worst or best series name I've come up with. There's no middle ground. Orochi joins you in Chapter 11. She's a level 7 diviner with decent magic, skill, and res stats, but the rest of her stats range from subpar to downright abysmal. Her defense and HP are pretty awful, but that's to be expected from a mage, so not a huge loss there. Similarly, her mediocre luck also doesn't really matter. It's not low enough that she's likely to face crits, and even still, she's frail enough to die without getting critical hit. Instead, I would say the stat deficiency that hurts Orochi the most is her speed. A base of 7 is already pretty bad, but her growth of only 30% means that it is not going to be getting better, and in fact, arguably gets worse since the enemies scale up much faster than she does. To give context for just how slow Orochi is, on her join map, she's incapable of doubling a single enemy on normal mode. And once you reach Lunatic, the vast majority of them double her. This low speed means that her 80% magic growth is significantly less impactful, since you almost always deal more damage by doubling foes than simply hitting them hard once. Now, in other games, you can sometimes take advantage of this by leveraging tomes that can't double, such as bolting. And even in Fates, these strong but slow units do have a niche in leveraging javelins, hand axes, and kodachi. But those are all physical weapons. The only magical tome that is unable to double is Nosferatu, And since that is meant for a bulky enemy phase unit, Orochi is kind of out of luck. She's always going to feel significantly worse than the mages who can double their foes. Now, don't get me wrong, this is Fates, and if you're determined enough, basically any stat can be super plastic. For example, base level Orochi is capable of doubling Invasion 1 archers if you give her a Swordmaster pair-up, a speed boosting meal, and a speed tonic. But that's a lot of resources just to double Invasion 1 enemies. And as you unlock new speed boosting tools like rallies, fancy footwork, and the horse spirit, enemies will get exponentially faster, locking Orochi into a doomed arms race as to whether or not she can double. For context of just how bad things are, the only two units in the cast slower than Orochi are Benny and Gunter. So rather than trying to fight against the tide, I think it's better to lean in and embrace that Orochi will never double, but also that she has access to a build that doesn't care about doubling. And that is, of course, a Vantage Sweeper. In order to grab Vantage, Orochi must marry one of the two male samurai, Hinata and Ryoma. I think Hinata is the better choice since he functionally joins on the same map as her, but if for some reason you like the idea of having Makoto's retainer marry her son, then Ryoma is technically a viable choice for this build. For the uninitiated, Vantage is a skill that means when you are at 50% HP or lower, you will always attack first, even on enemy phase. Thus, the idea behind Vantage sweeping is you get a unit injured, and then have them kill everyone before they take a single blow. As such, the two most important values for a Vantage Sweeper are big damage and perfect accuracy. And thankfully, magic and skill are the two stats that Orochi excels in. But kill thresholds in Rev are very high, so it takes more than just a capped magic Omnioji to one-shot every enemy. We can start with damage boosting skills. Magic +2 and Tome Fair innately come from the Omnioji class, and if we're marrying a samurai, then we might as well grab Life and Death. With Nyx's friendship, Orochi can reclass to Sorcerer, both to bolster her magic cap and get +5 hit innately. Sorcerer also potentially grants access to the S-rank tome Excalibur, which is the best weapon for Vantage sweeping, and Heartseeker if you want to increase Orochi's accuracy further. This can be especially useful for the Duelist Blow Swordmasters that haunt Rev's endgame. But as cool as this build is, it has a very obvious weakness. It falls apart as soon as you meet an enemy who has too much res to be one-shot, or too much avoid to be a guaranteed hit. The aforementioned Swordmasters, enemy Master Ninjas, and even other Omnioji can present a huge problem to a Vantage Life and Death Orochi. Don't get me wrong, Orochi can still selectively defeat groups of enemies, but if you've invested in a scrub this much, the payoff only being brainlessly killing certain groups of enemies feels a little bit disappointing. But thankfully, we can actually take this build even farther by looking to Orochi's Heartseal class Apothecary. I'm fairly certain that the reason Orochi has Apothecary as her Heartseal class is so that she can be a reflection of Niles, the capture unit on Nor's route. Niles starts out as an Outlaw, which is a bow class, but he can Heartseal into Dark Mage, which is a tome class. Meanwhile, Orochi starts out as a Diviner, which is a tome class, but she can Heartseal into Apothecary, which is a bow class. In Niles' case, this combination makes an amount of sense since he's more of a hybrid unit and he can use either physical or magical damage to capture enemies. But Orochi is highly specialized, so physical bows are not particularly good for her. If you were really devoted, you could train her bow rank up to make her a Shining Bow nuke, but I think that's much more easily accomplished with Mitama and Sakura. Instead, the main thing that Apothecary brings to the table for Orochi is the Replicate skill. Replicate allows a unit to split into two identical copies. They share an HP pool, which is normally a downside, but in Orochi's case is kind of an upside since she wants to set up Vantage anyway. So setting up Vantage on one of the replicas would also set it up on the other one. This means theoretically you could split them apart and Vantage sweep two different halves of a map at a time, which can be nice on a few late game chapters. But the bigger deal is that this can enable a strategy called Dual Vantage Attack Stance, or DVAS for short. DVAS is exactly what it sounds like. You have two Vantage sweepers in attack stance with each other so that no matter who gets attacked, Vantage is active. Then you will land two gigantic attacks against your foes with the plus 10 hit from attack stance to boot. The biggest downside is this build relies on you training up two different Vantage sweepers. So if you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself, why not just train up one Vantage sweeper and make them clone themselves? Because of the way that attack stance works, you can functionally think of this as a 1.5 times damage multiplier to all of the damage Orochi is doing. Sure, 1.5 is less than the 3 or 4 times damage multiplier of critical hits, but when you're outputting as much damage as this frail fortune teller is, 1.5 times is more than enough of a multiplier to nuke anything that approaches you. Having done this build myself, I can say the extra damage is so overkill you can reasonably drop one of the damage boosting skills to fit Quixotic, since really the only way you're not going to be killing your enemies is if you don't hit them. But as impressive as it is to just turn your brain off and sweep through the last 4 or 5 chapters of the game, in some ways this build does not feel worth the amount of effort you have to put in. Part of that is different enemy layouts are going to mean you need to equip different weapons, so you can't always sweep the entire map effortlessly. If there are sword masters mixed in with ninjas mixed in with axe enemies, then suddenly you can't choose between Calamity Gate or Excalibur. And I would say any hit rate below 100% is completely unacceptable when missing means death. But speaking of that, even just getting into vantage range can be tricky, because with life and death equipped, Orochi is oftentimes frail enough that she gets one shot from full HP. And if you unequip life and death, you are failing to reach some of the higher kill thresholds. Mages aren't even necessarily the best way to do this, since Orochi's high resistance means they oftentimes won't do enough damage to knock her into vantage range on their own. It can be a pretty frustrating hassle, especially since you want to turn Vantage on ASAP, so usually you try to limit yourself to the enemies near the start of the map. It just seems like a lot of trouble to put in after the build is complete. After all, Life and Death Replicate Orochi is the most investment-intensive build in the entire Fates trilogy. Life and Death, Tome Fair, and Replicate are all level 15 skills, and they're all from different class lines. Replicate comes from Apothecary, Life and Death comes from Samurai, and Tome Fair comes from Diviner. Getting a single level 15 promoted skill is difficult enough for units not named Jacob and Felicia, but adding 3 of them to the same build is damn near impossible. In fact, because of the way that skills work in Fates, you either need to use an Eternal Seal to extend your cat beyond level 20, or reclass Orochi multiple times at low level so she can pick up the unpromoted skills for Samurai, Apothecary, and Diviner. Because simply being a level 15 Mechanist doesn't give you Replicate. Instead, in order to get it, Orochi will need to have already acquired Quick Salve, Potent Potion, and Golem Bane. And the same goes for the Samurai skills in Master of Arms, and the Diviner skills in Omnioji. Overall, without an Eternal Seal, Orochi will need at least 6 reclasses, and careful planning to ensure you don't accidentally get yourself over-leveled. But here's the funny thing about all of that planning and investment. Remember a few minutes ago when I said Replicate Vantage is the best way to get a DVAS build online?
I lied.
Thanks to the way that Inheritance works, it's actually not that difficult to get Vantage in Life and Death on 2 units by only training 1. My personal pick for the best father-son duo to do a dual Vantage attack stance build with is Ryoma and Shiro, both of whom are pretty exceptional physical units with access to a large number of both damage and accuracy boosting skills. Camilla Marriage is probably the best option for this pairing since she'll provide her son good stats and useful skills, but Kagero is a decent alternative since she gives really high strength and is a fast support with Ryoma. The biggest issue with Kagero Mom is her skill issue is hereditary, but since Shiro can access Quixotic either through his mother or just his native class line, that's not going to be the biggest issue in the world. While Shiro is probably the best Gen 2 unit at doing DVAS with his dad, he's certainly not the only one capable of doing it. Ophelia and Odin are a duo that can potentially hit on both sides of the spectrum, with Odin in a physical build and Ophelia in a magical one. Saizo and Asuji are another fairly straightforward iteration of this build, and if you're willing to turn to higher investment options, there's also Hayato and Rajat, or even Forrest and Leah. Although that last one requires so much investment that it might actually be more costly than a Replicate Orochi is. Now, I know there are some people out there who don't like using the child units, so it might still sound like Replicate Orochi is the way to go for DVAS, but I would argue that even limiting ourselves to Gen 1, there are a few other duos who work very well together in dual vantage attack stance. I mentioned having Ryoma marry either Camilla or Kagero for the sake of his son being his pair-up partner, but arguably Vantage Camilla or Vantage Kagero could also be half of a DVAS duo with Ryoma. Although personally, my favorite partner for him is his canonical husband Xander. And since the two of them get access to powerful 1-2 range swords, it's not unreasonable to apply a bunch of damage stacking skills and just have them sweep through maps together. Although at this point, I've gotten pretty far off topic. This video was supposed to be about Orochi after all. So it's worth acknowledging that Orochi herself can potentially also participate in these DVAS duos with another unit. And this is arguably an even better use of her vantage sweeping than the Replicate build is, since it doesn't require you to spend any time in Apothecary, and therefore takes fewer seals, less experience, and less focus on this kind of mediocre fortune teller. Another benefit of pairing Orochi with someone else instead of her own replica is something that Fire Emblem Cypher players are probably all too familiar with. You cannot support yourself, even if it's a clone. In attack stance, Orochi provides phenomenal support bonuses, giving a total of plus 30 hit at S rank or plus 20 if she's locked to A rank. Since DVAS is a build where you really don't want to be missing, this extra 20 to 30 hit can be incredibly relevant to her partner. Unfortunately, the best DVAS partners for Orochi don't give any hit beyond the default 10 for being an attack stance, but I don't think that's the end of the world, since you can just slap accuracy boosting skills on her, and she has a really high skill stat, plus uses a naturally accurate weapon type in tomes. As for who Orochi should have as her partner, I'd say basically any of the other Vantage Sweepers will do. Ryoma is probably the easiest option, just because he already shows up with Vantage and good stats. Plus, you can go for their S support in order to get Vantage on Orochi herself, but honestly, marrying Hinata and then just A supporting whoever your actual partner is probably the faster and easier way to get this build online. While Vantage Sweeping is probably the best thing Orochi can do for you, she does technically have a couple of other options in her toolkit. Since Apothecary is such a rare class, you could take advantage of the Profiteer skill to try to supplement your gold income, but Orochi doesn't exactly have a good luck stat, and not only is the Shining Bow expensive, but going through 2 whole weapon ranks just to get it and fail to double foes is, well, let's just say the payoff is probably not worth the struggle. Similarly, it's tempting to turn Orochi into a staff bot since she has really high magic and skill growths, meaning that her accuracy with some of the higher tier status staffs will be unparalleled. But since she doesn't start in a staff class, she'll need to either promote or marry Azama or Jacob, and at this point she will only have E-rank staffs, which is just not where you want to be in the mid-game. Like, it's slow enough to build staff rank on your staff-locked units. Turning Orochi into a dedicated staffer is probably going to cost you the arm scroll. I'll say if you are trying to make Orochi into a dedicated staffer, then Jacob marriage is probably the best path for it, since this will let you add the utility skills from Troubadour to Orochi's kit, and you can potentially cope on Replicate plus Auras, but if you want a replicating Aura bot, just use Jacob, Felicia, or Dwyer. They get Replicate much earlier through Ninja Marriage. I don't know, y'all. It's weird, but despite not being a Corrin sexual, Orochi feels like one of the more inflexible units in the Fates cast. She can technically get a bunch of different classes through marriage and friendship, but most of them don't particularly help her, and she doesn't have that many full builds to class into. Beyond being a Vantage Sweeper, there's just nothing else she brings to the table. Well, that's not entirely accurate, because she does have a very unique personal skill, Capture. And as promised at the start of the video, I am going to be talking about the various generic units you can add to your army, and how, in my opinion, they benefit your army much more on this route than the other two. First, I'm going to briefly go over how capturing works in Fates for the uninitiated. So if you're already familiar with the prison system, there's a timestamp below that you can skip to. During my castle, one of the buildings you can construct is the prison. And once you do this, you are able to use the capture command with Orochi and Niles, which allows you to attempt to throw your foes in prison instead of murdering them. Initially, you can only fit 2 prisoners at a time, but as you upgrade your jailhouse more, you can fit more captives. If you're attempting to capture your foe, you suffer a couple of penalties. Firstly, if you are in attack stance, you won't be able to receive any dual strikes from your allies. In fact, you can't get any of the attack stance bonuses, whether they be from support ranks or just the generic plus 10 hit you get from being in attack stance. You do still get minor hit bonuses from adjacency, as all units do, and you still benefit from the stat bonuses from being paired up in guard stance. The unit attempting to capture will also face a minus 10 hit penalty, which is supposed to represent that it's more difficult to take an enemy alive than aim for a killing blow. Only certain enemies can be captured. As a general rule of thumb, your foe must be human if you want to capture them, so no Faceless, Stoneborn, Wolfskin, or Kitsune. Although that isn't such a big deal for Rev, since the Faceless are relatively rare, and Stoneborn, Kitsune, and Wolfskin just don't exist outside of Conquest and Birthright routes. The bigger deal from a Rev perspective is that Valite soldiers also cannot be captured, which means that all of the main story chapters from 18 onwards feature 0 capturable units, not even the bosses. Because while some bosses, such as Haitaka or Daniela, can be captured, the more story-relevant ones cannot. And in Revelation, all of the non-paralog bosses are either story-relevant or Valites. Once an enemy is in jail, you can recruit them either by bribing them with some castle resources like gems and food, or by convincing them over a set number of chapters or real-life days, eventually wearing them down and causing them to join your army. These two methods can potentially combine with each other as well, since the more you convince an enemy, the less resources they ask for in order to join your forces. Once you convince an enemy to turncoat, they will be a member of your roster. However, they will join you with an empty inventory rather than bringing whatever weapons they had equipped as an enemy. They will still retain any skills they had, except for a few enemy-specific ones such as Inevitable End or Wing Shield. Your generic captured units will level up using generic growths, and as a result, usually have worse growth rates than your named characters. However, the capturable bosses often have personal growth rates associated with them, and sometimes these can be quite high. It's worth noting that the personal growth rates assigned to bosses only take effect once you capture them. They are not factored in while auto-leveling. So if, for example, you want to take advantage of Gazak's massive growth rates, you want to capture him earlier rather than later, since he gets the better growth rates as a captured unit than as a generic boss. Lastly, captured units only have one class set. So if they are tier 1, they will not be able to reclass at all, and if they're tier 2, they can only reclass within their class set. So the captured Malignite Nichol can reclass into Wyvern Lord, but he doesn't have any other Heart Seal classes. The only exception to this is Candace, the capturable boss in Midori's paralogue, because she is unable to reclass to Bow Knight, which would normally be the alternate class for Adventurer. The suspected reason for this is Candace is fat and would require an additional custom model if they wanted to put her on a horse, so she couldn't just use the generic Bow Knight model, and the developers probably thought this would be too much work. Now, as for why I think captures are better on Rev than the other two routes, we have to break down how Birthright, Conquest, and Revelation do their difficulty, because each game actually has a different approach to how they differentiate between normal, hard, and lunatic. In Birthright, the primary thing that is cranked up are the enemy numbers, with the higher difficulties featuring the relative same quality enemy as lower ones, but just significantly more waves of reinforcements. Additionally, their enemies usually do not have unique skills. In fact, most Birthright enemies don't have any skills at all, and as such, this game tends to have the least desirable captures of the 3 rounds. Grabbing a pre-promote early can be good, although oftentimes they're not that much higher statted than the premier Birthright units. Instead, I think the main reason you would want to capture a unit on the Birthright route is to gain access to an otherwise rare class, such as General or Great Knight for backpacks, or the Berserkers to give you rally strength. These niches can be useful, especially in a low-man run, but for the most part, named characters are just going to be significantly better than anything you can capture while fighting for Hoshido. On the other hand, Conquest handles its difficulty by creating unique enemy formations with dangerous skill combinations. Overall, the stats of Conquest enemies are actually not all that impressive. In fact, they're usually significantly weaker than the ones you have, but they're bolstered by strong weapons and stronger skill combos. There's life and death samurai, counter archers, lunge chains consisting of ninjas that debuff you and lower your HP with poison strike, wary fighter generals you must leverage attack stance against, hexing rods and freeze staffs, and all sorts of other nonsense, most of which does not transfer to the player. Like, even if you capture one of the master ninjas who lunge your units into oblivion, the ninja itself isn't all that impressive. It's the fact that you have to fight 7 of them in one turn that gets you killed. And skills like counter might be dangerous on enemies, but on your units, they're nearly useless. You don't want your units to be taking tons of damage, and so counter tends to not do that much to the enemies in return. There are a few skill combinations that people like. Everyone gasses up the Pass Falco Knights since you can use them for a skip in endgame, and the famous Rallyman can bolster your unit's strength, speed, defense, and resistance, so that's nice to pick up. But even in these cases, you can accomplish their jobs more easily with named units, so the captures end up being more of an Iron Man safety valve situation. Someone you can add to your team if things went wrong, but they're never going to be all-stars in their own right. I think the biggest use case for a capture is in the early game, where you can get access to skills that you wouldn't reasonably have on your own units, such as rally defense on the famous Haitaka. But aside from that, I think the Conquest capturables are pretty severely overrated, especially in comparison to the top tier cast that you have in that route. Early game all-stars like Effie, Odin, Silas, and the Servants are going to do much more for you than a random capturable ninja can. Meanwhile, in Revelation, the early game cast is kind of underwhelming. I think that units like Tsubaki and Hana are pretty underrated, but even still, it's impossible to deny that they don't hold a candle to the all-stars in Nor. And meanwhile, the enemies in Revelation are scaled up by their stats, a measuring stick that translates much more into player control than skills and formations do. Since they're working off of generic growths, the capturables still don't scale particularly well long-term, but as a short-term solution, a overpowered pre-promoted Master Ninja or Berserker is often going to be more useful than Hinata is. Of course, using captures short-term isn't without its downsides either, the most prominent of which is their inability to build supports. meaning that you can't use them short-term to help a long-term unit's build, and you can't use them to access Child Paralouges, which are a good source of not only additional units, but additional experience as well. Still, if for whatever reason you don't want to take advantage of Child Paralouges, or don't consider yourself good enough at support routing to take advantage of the temporary units, then the high stats and weapon ranks of the generics can prove incredibly helpful to your army. That is, if you can manage to capture them. Because while Orochi has very good growths in magic and skill, her bases leave something to be desired. And unfortunately, the best capturables are on her join map, so you don't have the opportunity to train her up, even in a context that allows for grinding. I am, of course, talking about the legendary Chapter 11 Master Ninjas. With 18 strength and 17 speed, these Master Ninjas should one-round the majority of foes for the next couple of maps. And in contrast to your own fragile ninjas, the defensive profiles of these generics are really good. 33 HP and 15 defense means that they will shrug off physical attacks, and 20 resistance means that mages are even more of a joke for them. Although, in fairness, if you want a Master Ninja who can be your anti-mage unit, the game does hand you Kaze for free. But here's the thing about that 20 resistance. The only capture unit you have access to at this time is Orochi. Unless you can bait them into equipping Katana, she's going to be facing weapon triangle disadvantage against the Master Ninja. And since they have 20 resistance, she's going to struggle to deal any damage whatsoever. It's not impossible to capture them. I've done it using a Strategist Felicia pair-up after debuffs from Steel Shurikens on Saizo and the Pyrotechnics plus Poison Strike combination, but even with as many accuracy buffs as I could afford, I was still facing a hit rate of 23%. So saying that this is not an Iron Man friendly strategy is a little bit of an understatement. Hilariously, there is kind of an option to get around this though. If you have Orochi reclass into Apothecary, then she can use a Forged Bronze Bow to leverage Weapon Triangle advantage against the ninjas instead of disadvantage. And while Orochi's personal magic is 5 points higher than her personal strength, as an Apothecary, her strength is only 3 points lower than her magic is as a Diviner. Considering the Mokushin have 5 less defense than resistance, and that bronze bows have higher might than any of the tomes Orochi can use at base, this is not only going to give her better accuracy, but likely better damage as well. You're still going to need to make up the difference through things like shuriken debuffs, pair-up, or forges, but honestly, if you want to capture the Master Ninjas, and you have a Heart Seal to spare, this isn't the worst strategy in the world. It just means that Orochi still isn't dodging the high investment accusations. Of course, while the Master Ninjas are the flashiest capturable enemies, you could go for the unpromoteds as well. The enemy Diviners are pretty bad, and Samurai isn't a particularly special class, but Oni is relatively unique, since the only other one you get is Rinka. So if you want to take advantage of any strategies that utilize the shove skill, getting 2 levels on a 17 strength unit is much easier than training Rinka up to level 10. The generic spear fighters are alright, but probably not worth one of your 2 prison slots. But the enemy archers are at least worth considering. Archer itself is such a good class that it even makes Kana pretend that she's a good unit. And while you do have access to 2 very strong archers of your own, in Mozu and Takumi, it's the sort of class where you might want a 3rd or even 4th one to add to your roster temporarily. Your last considerations are ninjas and Shrine Maiden, and I don't think either of these are particularly worthwhile. You already have 3 unpromoted ninjas at the end of Chapter 11, so getting a 4th just feels excessive. And similarly, you have 2 staffers in your early servant and Sakura. Staffing is already not a super valuable role in Rev, so having a unit who only provide you with the Shrine Maiden staffing is just less value for a deployment slot than I would like. Chapter 12 is a smorgasbord of Norian classes, which are inherently more valuable since you don't get the Norian units until later in the campaign. I think the most notable enemies here are the Berserkers, who are not only incredibly strong at 38 HP, 22 strength, 15 skill, 18 speed, and 16 defense, but also really easy for Orochi to capture. They only have 5 resistance and have weapon triangle disadvantage against tomes. They also come equipped with HP plus 5, which means their 38 HP is bolstered up to 43. Truly impressive numbers. Even though Berserker isn't a great combat class, these generics can carry themselves for a while on raw stats alone, and worst case scenario, they're a really good backpack that can eventually provide rally strength. The other set of promoted goons are sorcerers, and these are going to be much harder for Orochi to capture thanks to their high resistance and their decent defense as well. With 15 defense and 19 res, there's not really an easy solution like Apothecary is for the ninjas. If you can get your hands on one of the sorcerers, they are pretty good. With 17 magic and 14 speed, they will do a decent amount to your foes. Although, honestly, their biggest piece of utility is coming with Heartseeker for free, which you can potentially grab from the unpromoted Dark Mages instead, and if Heartseeker's all you want, that would be my recommendation. Well, that or Nyx. Lastly, there's a couple of outlaws you could capture, and they have an impressively high base strength of 18, so if you want a combat bow knight, just instant promoting them is not a terrible decision, but considering how sparse Master Seals are in Rev, I wouldn't recommend spending a Master Seal on a capturable generic, unless you are doing a challenge run that requires it for some reason. Unfortunately, a good number of Chapter 13's enemies, including its wyverns, are not capturable because they're Valite soldiers, but the Norians and Hoshidans can be put in jail. Here you get another chance at overpowered Master Ninjas, as well as a few other promoted units, most notably an Omnioji, a Master of Arms, and a couple of Paladins. While I wouldn't call these capturables as impressive as the Chapter 11 Master Ninjas or even the Berserkers from Chapter 12, it's worth noting that all of the promoted units on this map have at least the same attack or possibly more than Camilla. Now, obviously Camilla has a lot of advantages that generic promoted Master of Arms don't, but it is still worth acknowledging that the stats of these pre-promotes keep up to a good degree, oftentimes more than your project units. And that pattern continues as we enter Chapter 14, where a large number of generals and paladins are easy pickings for Orochi. The generals make very impressive physical walls, which is a desirable role in Revelation, but the paladins are perhaps more notable since they are very easily compared to Silas, the cavalier that you recruit at the end of Chapter 14. If given an instant promotion, Silas will have slightly better stats than these paladins, and of course he benefits from not only support ranks, but a very strong personal skill and a nice reclass set into mercenary. So he is definitely better than the paladins. But he's also pretty universally considered one of the best units in Rev. So the fact that the Paladins are so comparable to him could potentially be enough to earn them a filler slot on some of the upcoming maps. Of course, the unspoken downside to this is that there are not that many deployment slots available in Chapters 15, 16, and 17. And not only that, but you get handed a large number of very powerful pre-promotes in the upcoming maps, with Zhara joining in 15, Ryoma joining in 16, and Xander and Leo joining in 17. Even Hinoka, who requires a Master Seal to be competent, is probably going to be doing better than these generic paladins would, And that's before factoring in any of the units you might have trained up from the early game, as well as children or Fuga who you will recruit soon after diving into Vala. And because Chapter 15 is entirely illusions, the last chapters where you can capture foes are Chapters 16 and 17, which are linked to each other, so you can't even recruit the generics from 16 until after you beat Chapter 17. These maps feature some berserkers, adventurers, paladins, great knights, dark knights, and even a couple of strategists. So if you're looking for new faces to add to your army of generics, you do have a lot of options, but it doesn't feel worth considering them since you also get handed the aforementioned busted pre-promotes that come with a whole slew of other advantages over the faceless mooks. There is one other aspect of capture I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the paralog units. Technically, Niles can also help you capture within paralogs, but realistically, Niles is pretty bad, and if you want someone who's going to capture late-game paralog units, Orochi is probably the better choice. For the most part, I'm really not a fan of these paralog units for basically the same reason I don't like the Chapter 16 and 17 captures. By this point in the game, your roster should be stuffed full of good units who well outclass the generic captures. But in a challenge run situation or an Iron Man gone wrong, it might be useful to pick someone up in Chapter 22 who has the stats that can potentially match them. After all, a trained Keaton will be good in Chapter 22, but an instantly benched one who you're bringing off just because Camilla and Ryoma died, probably not going to perform as well. So in that scenario, dipping into a Suji's Paralog to grab yourself a random Master Ninja might be more appealing. Of course, the unspoken downside is that if you're dipping into a Child Paralog, you are already recruiting a child unit who will scale up to the point you recruit them, but it's possible that these captures are better than some of the lower quality children, or if you did unconventional pairings, then yeah, a Nyx Valoria is probably not going to be an all-star. Not every paralog is going to have capturable foes. There are quite a lot of birthright ones where most enemies are faceless, and many of the shared route paralogs have the Valites as the foes you face. But Sophie and Midori's paralogs are noteworthy for having capturable foes and enemies that are significantly above the expected level curve in the main campaign. So that might be a good place to start if you're looking for generics to fill out your roster. Both of these maps do also feature powerful Wyvern Lords, and since that is a generically good class, that's what I would recommend for paralog capturables. Outside of these, there are only 3 Birthright paralogs with capturable foes, those being Asuji's Paralog, Selki's Paralog, and Shiro's Paralog. Notable amongst these 3, Selki's Paralog has stationary snipers, meaning they are basically free to capture since you can just go at one range and not face any risk of retaliation, and Sniper is a very good class, so I wouldn't say these are anywhere near as powerful as the Chapter 11 Master Ninjas, but they are basically free and filler units. I've saved the Conquest exclusive paralogs for last because they're the only ones that have generics with unique skills, which tends to be a selling point for a lot of people when it comes to the capturable units. Unfortunately, the majority of skills given in the paralog chapters are not that interesting. Ophelia's Paralog features pass on some classes that you wouldn't expect, and seal skills that are not super useful for the player, but the one noteworthy skill combination is Darting Blow on Wyvern Lords. In theory, this is actually pretty good, since Wyvern is a good class and Darting Blow increases your speed on player phase, but in practice, I find that the majority of player characters, even capturable generics, are able to meet speed benchmarks without the help of Darting Blow. I guess it helps against the extra speedy enemies like Sword Masters and Master Ninjas, but honestly, this feels more like a good in theory, bad in practice situation. Soleil's Paralog gives you access to Lunge Ninjas, which is a pretty cool combination, and Elise Ophelia is a much higher bar to get in Rev than Conquest, so you might actually be in the market for a Lunge Mage. But aside from them, there's not really anything notable. Duelist Blow Berserkers or Poison Strike Bow Knights just don't really sound like a huge selling point to me. Nina's Paralogue has a couple of appealing candidates. There's some high HP Berserkers with the counter skill, which I don't think is particularly good, but is definitely a funny way to kill foes. I think the more interesting capture on Nina's map are the Inspiration Generals, not because they have particularly good stats, they are enemy generals, so they're kind of bad, but Inspiration itself is a very good skill. Unfortunately, it's also a skill you have pretty easy access to, with Jacob, Felicia, and Dwyer all being easy candidates, and whoever Felicia's kid is can also get Inspiration via inheritance. In an Iron Man Gone Wrong situation, it might be nice to have an extra copy, but since Inspiration doesn't stack with itself, there's not really a benefit to these generals while your servants are still alive. And getting Niles an S support in order to unlock Nina's Paralogue is far more investment than the single heart seal it takes to get Inspiration as early as Chapter 12. The last map that you can actually capture foes on is Forest's Paralogue, which features some pretty insane stat creep and powerful skills like Darting Blow, Trample, and Certain Blow. The Trample Paladins are probably not worth it, but Certain Blow Berserkers or Darting Blow heroes could be nice. I think they're almost always going to be worse than the named characters, but again, in a failed Iron Man or other challenge run situation, you take what you can get, and filler units are filler units, right? Of course, captured pilled gamers are not going to Forest Paralogue simply to pick up a Darting Blow hero or a Trample Paladin. The real prize they have their eye on is Gazak, one of the many capturable bosses from Paralogues. Capturable bosses have a couple of quirks that don't apply to the generic units. Since they have their own set of growth rates, they will generally scale better once you capture them as compared to the other generics. However, before you capture them, they will auto-level using generic growths. So the later you access Forest Paralogue, the fewer levels Gazak can use his bonkers growths with, perhaps turning him into a Karel archetype. Additionally, on the Conquest route, many of the capturable bosses have unique skill combinations that go beyond what is assigned to generic mooks. But with a few exceptions, I think the capturable bosses are actually kind of lame. Like, people elevate them because they have unique growths and they have a portrait to themselves, but functionally, they're oftentimes just worse than the generics, even accounting for the skill combinations. I know the Chapter 11 Master Ninjas are the gold standard I'm comparing everything to, but honestly, I'd rather have one of them than the majority of the Paralogue capturable bosses as well. Especially when looking at the Shared Route Paralogues or the Birthright Paralogues, wherein bosses are often just outclassed by generics on their maps. Take, for example, Nichol, the boss of Sophie's Paralogue, who is a Malignite with pretty decent hybrid stats. But you can capture Wyvern Lords in the same chapter, and oftentimes they will just have better bases than Nichol does. Sure, they don't have unique portraits and they're just named Ronald and Victor and whatever other generic Norian names you can come up with, but it's not like Nichol has a personality or supports to flesh out his character. He is, for all intents and purposes, interchangeable with his minions. And considering how late Silas joins you in the Revelation route, I think by the time you unlock Sophie's Paralogue, you're going to prefer the Wyvern Lord to the Malignite. Candace, the boss of Midori's Paralogue, is in an even worse position, because she is an adventurer, which is not a particularly good class, and you can't even spend a heart seal on her to send her into the Bow Knight line. As I mentioned earlier, due to her fat model, the devs just didn't bother giving her a reclass option. Her stats are also really unimpressive. She has decent strength, but everything else is pretty subpar, and her personal growth rates are also pretty bad, with the only two that even crack 50% being luck and resistance. Not exactly the all-star stats you want. However, Candace and Nichol are not the only bosses from the shared route Paralouges, because Kana's Paralogue is weird. Even though all of the generic enemies and the initial boss are from Vala and therefore cannot be captured, if you wait long enough, reinforcements start showing up, and the first wave of reinforcements is this game's pair of Bandit Twins, Lloyd and Llewellyn, and you can actually capture them. They're both berserkers with no skills, but weirdly, they actually have pretty decent stats, with in particular high HP and strength, as well as decent enough speed to meet a good number of thresholds before meals and rallies. While both brothers have identical bases, they actually have different growths. Lloyd has an 85% strength growth, so if all you want to do is hit something hard, then he'll scale pretty well throughout most of the game. But unfortunately, the majority of the rest of his growths range from middling to bad, with the exception of his HP, which is at 115%. In fact, he shares this growth with his twin brother, who has a more balanced spread. Only a 70% strength growth, but 60% speed, so he'll often double things that Lloyd might not. Despite being more balanced, I think Llewellyn is probably the better of the two growths-wise, mostly owing to the fact that he only loses 15% strength growth, so he'll still trigger it much more often than not. I don't love Berserker as a class, and I don't think it's worth spending a heart seal on these two, but if we're looking at things from an Iron Man perspective, you will at least always have access to Kana's Paralogue since Corrin is a game over condition, and therefore you can always capture these two as a backup plan. Their stats are serviceable enough that they can be filler units, if not all-stars. Of course, if all you're looking for is a Berserker with decent stats, you can do much better than the Bandit Twins. Tarba, the boss of Shiro's map, has comparable growths to the Bandit Twins, but a significant lead in his base HP, albeit for a much downgraded 14 base speed, which is kind of pathetic and means that he's not going to be doubling much. Instead, you should probably turn to Gazak, the boss of Forest Paralogue. He's one of the most popular captures for a reason. On the surface, his stats don't look that much better than the other Berserkers, and in some ways they kind of seem worse, but that's because he starts out as a fighter. So this isn't accounting for the promotion bonuses and auto levels he's sure to get, thanks to being tied to Forest, one of the later joining children. As a conquest enemy, he also comes packed with skills, the most notable of which is Certain Blow, which gives him 40 extra hit on player phase to patch up axe accuracy. But Pavise and Good Fortune are... well, they exist at least. Good Fortune is there as a meme, a joke at Arthur's expense, because Arthur is unlucky and he gets mistaken for Gazak, who is lucky. But Pavise is just kinda whatever. It gives you a chance to cut damage from swords, lances, and axes in half, and that's nice, but it's too unreliable to really be a crucial part of your kit, and while Gazak does have a really high defense growth, I still don't think he's particularly good at enemy phasing, just because Berserker is kind of a stinky class. I guess if you're really desperate, you could feed this generic a heart seal and combine Pavas with Soul in order to be the most chance-based enemy phaser possible, but like, that's not even good, and we're really investing in a guy whose main appeal is having stats without investment, so I don't think it's worth it. Speaking of not really worth it, I kind of skipped over the other two Birthright bosses, but that's because they are remarkably bad, even when compared to Tarba. Funke is an adventurer with underwhelming stats, and Daichi is a Basara with underwhelming stats. The coolest thing about these two is that Funke has a funny face smelling a flower. Be honest, if I hadn't mentioned them like 20 seconds ago, would you even remember this duo of bosses exists? Although, I guess I could say the same thing about the remaining two Conquest bosses. Go ahead, what is the boss of Soleil's Paralogue named? No looking it up, that's cheating. You don't know, do you? It's Zhara. And he starts out as a mercenary with actually pretty decent stats. I mean, decent by capturable standards. These aren't going to be anything compared to your growth units. He ends up going hero as he auto-levels anyway, so starting with Soul isn't a huge deal, although it does mean that he can immediately reclass into Bow Knight without missing out on any skills. But Pass is kind of interesting. I mean, you can get Pass on Bow Knights through the Outlaw line, but that requires using Niles and Nina, who are not particularly good, or Shura, who, in my opinion, functions much better as a low-investment filler unit than a high-investment carry. Either way, Pass is a relatively rare skill, and if you're trying to low-turn specific maps, it can be useful, but overall, I don't think it's actually all that good. And the same applies to counter magic. It's rare, but it's not very good. You don't often face mages who you're gonna have trouble killing with your physical units, and when you do, the solution being take a bunch of damage from them doesn't feel great. Although, as haha funny anti-mage bosses go, I gotta say, Senno takes the cake, because he is an apothecary in Ophelia's Paralogue who has seal magic specifically to fuck over the unit you recruit on his map. He does also have Potent Potion, which is just an apothecary-based skill, and Lucky 7, which is a nice accuracy booster. I've talked about it before, being a good way to bolster you in the first 7 turns, which are typically the most important turns in any Fire Emblem map, although in Fire Emblem Fates Revelation, chapters often drag on past the 7 turn slot, so it can often feel like a dead skill slot, but honestly, on a generic capturable, that's not really a problem because so many generic capturables literally have empty skill slots they can't fill. In fact, being a bow class that has an accuracy boosting skill comes with the benefit of being able to leverage Yumis, which are stronger than traditional bows, but have the trade-off of lower accuracy. Granted, anyone with access to the Archer class line also has this combination, as does anyone with access to the Outlaw class line, but Senno just wants to feel like a special little cupcake, so please don't tell him about that, okay? It would just break his heart if he learned he wasn't unique. But that's really all there is to be said about the capturable bosses. I think most of them are just worse than the nameless generics, but people glom onto them because they have a portrait and a specific name. They do technically fill the niche of being recruitable in Vala, but that's not really a niche that I value super highly. Even within an Iron Man setting, you still have to keep Orochi alive in order to capture all these backup units, and Orochi isn't exactly the most durable gal out there. I guess you could also keep Niles alive, but he is similarly frail. Don't get me wrong, if you're the sort of person that really likes the capturable bosses, then good for you. You should use them. They're cool to the people who think they're cool. But from a gameplay perspective, they just don't really offer anything that you can't get more easily and better with the named cast. And speaking of the named cast, let's take a look at our tier list of actual characters. Judging solely based on the tier names, I think the only place for Orochi is D tier, demand disproportionate investment to their payoff. Because whether you're going for DVAS Replicate, requiring a bunch of seals and a bunch of experience, or you're trying to capture units who require you to rig some bad RNG stuff just to get Master Ninjas, or aggressively pursue pairings only to grab the worst units from the Paralogue instead of the children, Orochi is almost always only going to contribute something if you invest into her heavily. I think I'd put her above Soleil and Forest just because they join so late and require a similar amount of investment, although probably less to get online than she does. But at least Orochi offers something relatively unique. I wouldn't say that it's fully unique, as I went over. There's plenty of other ways to accomplish an attack stance vantage sweep, but being able to do it with a replica of yourself is something that has a novelty to it, even if it isn't necessarily the best way to sweep through maps. I'd still rank her pretty significantly below the C-tier units. Kana's rally build is better than any of Orochi's options, Rinka has the full defense growth she can lean into, and Gunter is legitimately super valuable early on. So, at least for now, the top of D-tier feels appropriate for the fortune teller. And you know what else feels appropriate? Thanking my patrons. So, thank you, Electric Giga, Erica Ford, YLO1, George Grenville the 7th PM, Jamie Collins, Arvis, Crispy Matthews, Floa Hay, I Like Rattata, Henry Fint, Amy Hazel, Neas Costa, Faulty Videos, Lyra, Kyle Madison, Derek Williams, Just Riley, Anna Cabana, Some Trades, The Daily Fugle, Faye, Magic Bite, Shinthia, Sardonic Muse, Psych, Chris, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Air of Emblem, Control Alt Ages, Roman Cormancic, Nick Knack Hammersmack, Mike, Lepton, Cabbage, SUP, Kaya Skull, Histiclop, Bree, Punchfighter Champion, Eggman, Maxine the Vampire Queen, Dragonback Lancer, Carrier Has Left, Jill, Angel Nap Caceres, Key the Iron Idol, Calamity Callie, Anom Wanderer, A Clever Username of Lies, Jackson McMahon, Saren Gurlixy, Tailored Muffin, Clan, Andu, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Firant, Your Doctor, Frozen Helm, Girl Boss, Lizard Bongwater, Christopher Bueno, Marin McLean, Jaden, Reflect, Formless Things, Dylan Solis, Guiji555, Smaz Ruby, Zycrom, Robin D, Alenby, Hound Dogs, They Thom, and especially my Jagans, Thick Molder, Adele, Alexander Roper, Siggy, and Cereal Bowl. If you would like to join the list of names on screen, there is a link to my Patreon below, and some of the benefits include early access to my videos, as well as the ability to vote on what happens next on the channel. Right now, there's a poll up for the next unit in this series that I cover. But please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Free ways to support me include liking, subscribing, commenting on the video, you know, all the YouTube stuff. And if there's anyone you think would enjoy this type of content, feel free to share it with them as well. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.